Brixton 2001. The local police commander, Brian Paddock, now a Lib Dem peer, changes police procedures so that people caught with small amounts of cannabis will not be arrested.
This policy will free up officers so they can concentrate on those more serious offences.
But the policy received a very mixed response. Steve Reed is now a shadow Home Office minister, but was a councillor in Lambeth at the time. He says the policy was a disaster.
Everyone in London that wanted to come and buy their drugs came down to Brixton. Now, the increase in gang activity as a result of that, which is gangs fighting for pitches to sell their drugs to all of these tourists, massively increased crime. It wasn't just the buying of drugs. There were street robberies, assaults, muggings, all sorts of things.
But this week at the Lib Dem conference, the party voted to adopt a policy not a million miles away from the Brixton experiment, which could eventually lead to marijuana being sold legally in what the Lib Dems call a controlled and regulated way.
If you just chuck a young person who's addicted into a prison, guess what happens? They just get addicted onto harder drugs, come out and become ever more helpless victims to the criminal gangs who sold them the drugs in the first place. So let's do the smart thing, which is give them treatment and help.
So, if you make it okay to buy weed everywhere in the UK, rather than just this one neighbourhood in South London, would that mean drugs tourism was no longer a factor? Amsterdam in Holland, a place where even the tourist shops sell drugs paraphernalia. People come here for lots of reasons, but for many a big draw is the coffee shops like this, where they can buy and smoke marijuana completely legally.
People come to the bar, they look at the menu. Nice menu with explanation of taste, smell and the effects. And a nice piece of hash maybe.
The shop is licensed by the state and pays tax, but the business model might struggle without one core group of customers.
I think in the high season, and yeah, it's a rough estimate, you know, but I think it will be 65–70% tourists coming in and 30–35% locals.
So might London prove a similar type of hit with the travellers. Would you be more likely to go to London, do you think?
Definitely. I think I'd be much more attracted to London. I think a lot more younger people would be as well.
So it'd be good for tourism?
It'd be great for tourism, and I think, yeah, it'd bring a lot more money into London as well.
But not everybody's so convinced about the benefits of this type of tourism. In fact, the national Dutch government has been trying to introduce restrictions so that coffee shops can't sell to foreigners. In the Dutch capital, the centre-right government has passed a law saying cities in the Netherlands can only sell marijuana to its own residents. Some cities like Maastricht have complied, while others, like Amsterdam, haven't. A key motivation for politicians here is what they saw as the wrong type of tourists coming.
We had a lot of criminality. It was a lot of people who came. They had a kind of behavior that you don't like to see. I mean, there was also a lot of drinking, sometimes stealing. So there were side effects that we didn't like.
So, depending on who you ask in Holland, their model is either something for us to copy or be wary of adopting.
And Simon Hughes is still with me here in the studio. Let's just be clear here. Are the Liberal Democrats talking about a nationwide policy of decriminalisation here? Because as we've seen in that film, Brixton and Amsterdam show quite clearly, if you do it in only specific areas, it leads to drugs tourism.
The answer is this is a policy for the whole country. Drugs policy would be England and Wales in this case, because obviously the Scots and the non-Irish could make their own decisions. And can I correct one really important thing? It's not decriminalisation. What it is simply changing the penalties, the punishment that people can get. So, and that's really important because it relates to that issue whether you track people.
So if somebody is
the difference is
and their
if you're picked up by the police and the police believe that the drugs on you are only for your personally, that's their call. If that's their judgment, then the one thing that disappears is the risk of going into prison for having the drugs for personal use.
So you're not arrested?
No, you could be arrested, you could be cautioned, you could be fined, you could be given community service, but you could not be locked up because we think locking people up for drugs for personal use does no good.
What do you think of that?
I'd go much further. I'm with a large body of people in this country who thought for a very long time that drugs per se should be decriminalised in this country. I mean, you have to look back to the 1930s and 20s in America and see what Prohibition did just with alcohol, and it absolutely fed the gang culture. The gang culture in America exploded and has never gone away. It was never as bad before Prohibition. The main problem with drugs in this country is the gang culture, the violence. You see that in that small experiment in Brixton. I would argue that you need complete decriminalisation of drugs. You need recovery centres to be set up. You need to actually get the fingers of the gangs out of the culture.
Do you agree with that, but you can't do it because it's politically... No, well, that's what I say. Do you agree with it personally, but it's not politically palatable?
No, I'm very sympathetic to that point of view.
Right.
And there are experiments going on in Europe, in Portugal and other places which are going down that road. And we want evidence-based policy, and there is a report due to be published soon from the Home Office which will report on looking at other... So there's a strong case for that. At the moment, we're not going that far because we think the first step is to make sure we don't fill up the prisons, and the prisons are too full of people who have a drug problem.
But politically, can I just say, that was quite a brave thing to say, because I've interviewed cabinet ministers who are in these debates, and in the studio they said, we will never, ever decriminalise drugs, it would be a huge mistake. And in the green room afterwards, over a glass of wine, they said, well, of course, I couldn't say, but I totally agree with you.
Right, well, you've heard it here, and you hasn't got a glass of wine, and you've even said it. But even though you've said it, would it ever really happen?
I think
because politically, even if your policy is taken on board for all right, it's not decriminalisation, but treating people differently if they're in possession of cannabis, would it ever be taken any further than that? Politically, would there ever be the will?
The answer is yes, I think it could in this country, if we have evidence-based policy. And therefore, two absolutely central strands, which Richard, I hope, would fully support, are that there's an advisory council on the misuse of drugs. We believe that their report ought to be implemented automatically, because what happens at the moment is the politicians often are afraid to do what the experts tell them that they should do, and they should have the chance to put their proposal on the table in Parliament. If Parliament wanted to vote them down, they could, but government shouldn't be tampering with the proposal.
Let's look at the evidence, though, because you say you would take it much further because of examples of prohibition and the gang culture. But are we saying that it would be normal then, in your vision of decriminalising drugs, that people would be able to shoot up heroin in the street?
Of course not, any more than you can have someone drunk and disorderly in the street. I mean, that's another analogy with alcohol. No, decriminalising drugs doesn't mean that you support the use of drugs in any way, shape or form, and I don't, and I've never used drugs in any way, shape or form.
Would that be the result of doing that?
Well, that's what people who are afraid of looking at this policy fear would happen. In my own opinion is that you would get no more people wanting to use drugs because they were decriminalised. I don't think people don't use drugs because they're frightened of being arrested or being fined or even going to prison. They use drugs because they choose to use drugs. And it's...
But more people might flirt with the idea if it wasn't actually illegal.
And I've had this conversation many times with groups of people, and on a show of hands, no one has ever put their hand up to say, well, if it was decriminalised, yeah, I'd do a bit of smack. No, they wouldn't.
Two very quick things. As in Glasgow, for a conference, I talked to a group of women in a women's centre after the conference, and many of them went into drugs gradually, and they just wanted help. They didn't want to be locked up in prison. They wanted to get off it. Secondly, the concentration of the law enforcement agencies should be on the big guys who are flogging, promoting, trying to get people addicted. And if we take the concentration away from people who are using drugs for their own use and concentrate on the people who are making money exploiting, we'd be doing a much better job.
Simon Hughes, thank you.